Welcome everyone to our composting workshop. So my name is Kaitlyn.
And I'm Jess. And yes, we are twins.
We're currently not in the Bay of Plenty. We are from Rotorua, but we are at the University of Canterbury, so we're actually in Christchurch today. So let's get started. Also, just make sure you mute yourself and turn your camera off. And we'll be answering any questions at the end.
And also a bit of background about us. So over the summer, we worked at the Rotorua Lakes Council as interns, and we were educating the public on composting. And we're also volunteers at Forest and Bird Youth, which is why the logo's there. And so we used to run the Rotorua Forest and Bird Youth Hub.
Yeah, and just a quick thing. We used to be one of those people that threw our food scraps in the bin too and sent them to landfill, but everybody started like that. So it's just about realizing, I guess, what you've been doing and changing to a better practice.
You always have to start somewhere, so composting is a good way to start.
Yeah. So here's our agenda for today. Wait, didn't miss a slide?
Yes.
Okay, so here's a song that we're just going to play for you. It's called Compost, and it's a very inspiring song. It teaches you how to compost, and we're just going to play it so you can see why we're so excited about composting. So enjoy.
Compost, don't throw away that food waste, make it compost. What to do with that apple core, be compost. Eat it and just put it where it all goes. Back to earth and nutrient rich compost. Don't throw away that food waste, make it compost. What to do with that apple core, be compost. Eat it and just put it where it all goes. Compost. What you gonna do with that banana peel? You had a meal and now you have a slimy peel. You have to deal, put it in the trash bin like other packages, but once it's in the trash and then the landfill, what happens then?
In the landfill, it doesn't get oxygen, cause non-organic trash is piled on top of it. So as it decomposes, it releases methane, a gas that's bad for noses and increases climate change.
But what if you could rearrange the molecules of matter that are left inside your apple cores and peels of your bananas, and turn them into something you can use again and scatter into soil for the plant so that their fruit gets even fatter?
If you mix your rotting food with dried up woods and leaves, it gives worms and microbes a tasty thing to eat. And when they eat it, they digest it, and it all goes back into the soil, and we call that soil compost.
Compost, don't throw away that food waste, make it compost. What to do with that apple core, be compost. Eat it and just put it where it all goes. Compost. Don't get worried, just get wormy. The pieces that you wouldn't eat, the worms eat in a hurry. Give the worms a home, poke tiny holes inside a bucket, but not too big of holes, so it won't let the bugs in.
Or if you have a backyard, it isn't that hard to put your scraps in piles up in layers like a stack of cards. And if you have no backyard or live in an apartment, you can save it in your freezer, then donate it to a garden.
Your food waste isn't waste, it actually makes wealth, cause everything is made from what was left from something else.
The health of all depends on how a small thing decomposes. Don't throw it all away, let it live again, compost it.
Consistently talking about cycles, microbial life will leave us with a brighter future that is, just nurture the kids. I'm talking about macro and micro organisms feed on the browns and greens. Another way to say this is carbon or nitrogen, or maybe even dead. Try with alive, but to get this black hole, just know ratios must be divine. From mesophilic to thermophilic, cooling in the cure step. It takes 4 stages to get compost just perfect. As we watch the heat and temperatures rise, we know our pile is working. The bugs, bacteria, and fungi work together, that's for certain. Compost means community, so move as one unit. We all have a part to play. Interdependence is the movement, and we move it cause we don't want no stinky smell. Anaerobic conditions prevent us from composting well. One thing I'll leave you with so that you know that you can do it too. First step is not to trash, but separate your scraps, stay food.
Compost, don't throw away that food waste, make it compost. What to do with that apple core, be compost. Eat it and just put it where it all goes. Back to earth and nutrient rich compost. Don't throw away that food waste, make it compost. What to do with that apple core, be compost. Eat it and just put it where it all goes. Compost.
Save your scraps, save your scraps. Don't put them in the trash. Save your scraps to the earth, they go right back. Save your scraps, and put them in a pile. If that's a no-go, then go to a food scrap drop-off site and smile.
So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that song. Remember to add it to your Spotify playlist because I'm sure you want to listen to it later.
Okay, so now that you're extremely motivated to get composting, we'll just quickly cover what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to talk about composting and the climate, so the link, and then we'll go over the basics of composting, and we'll split up composting into 3 categories to suit your lifestyle. So the time poor composter, the good citizen composter, and the compost fanatic.
So why is composting so important? When you put your food scraps in the rubbish bin, it ends up in the landfill, which is this ugly place shown in this photo. And when your food scraps is in the landfill, it releases methane gas, which increases climate change and contributes to the climate crisis. But in composting, your food scraps actually enhances the soil health, and so it's no longer a wasted resource.
And these are some benefits of composting, of how it will benefit you. So it will decrease your ecological footprint. It will improve the health of the plants in your garden. It will decrease the amount of waste you send to landfill. And you'll also be able to create high quality chemical-free compost, as you can't really trust what's in the compost that you buy from like conventional stores, for example.
So what kind of compost bin? This is where you should start. And so there's many varieties that you can choose from. So we'll be covering that today.
And this can be quite overwhelming if you don't know. So we've just done like a pros and cons list for you of what we've found. So this is in our opinion. So the pros of the black plastic compost bins is that it's quite tidy. And if it's smelly, which composting shouldn't be, then the flies aren't everywhere as it has a lid on top. Cons is that it costs about $50 to $70. You have to manually add moisture as there's a lid so rain can't just come in, and also because there's sides around the compost bin, airflow can't just like come through, and it's also harder to turn and it's harder to get finished compost out of it.
So you can also have wooden pallets for your compost bin. This is what Kaitlyn and I prefer the most. So the pros is that there's constant airflow for the pile since there's open sides. There's also constant moisture because there's no lid, so the rainfall gets in. It's also cheap and free to make. You can just pick up pallets from the side of the road, but make sure they're untreated. It's easy to get finished compost out of it, and it's easy to turn. And the only con is it can look less tidy compared to black bins. But I think personally it looks better.
And also don't feel like you have to remember all this. We're going to send out the presentation at the end, or you can take photos if you like. Okay, so you can also do worm farming. So that's a type of vermicomposting. So the pros is that it's very tidy, it's easy to manage, and it doesn't require a lot of time, as you can just drop your food scraps in and then go. But the cons is that the worms don't have rights, as they're confined to this tiny black plastic container, whereas if they're outside, they can be free to move through the soil. And a small quantity of food waste can only be fed at a time, otherwise you can overfeed your worms, and people tend to get problems with acidity.
You can also have an in-ground worm farm. So the pros of this is that there are worm rights because the worms can move throughout the soil. It also looks tidier, easier to manage, doesn't require a lot of time, just the drop and go method, and it's cheap. So to make your own one at home, you can just have a bucket, drill some holes in the bottom and sides, and just stick it in the soil and you're good to go. And the only con, like the other worm farm, is you can only add a small quantity of food waste at a time. So make sure that your compost bin is on grass or soil, not on concrete, because if it doesn't have any contact with the soil, your compost cannot break down. But for the worm farm, it doesn't have to be on soil.
The raised worm farm. Yeah. So after you have your compost bin and you know where you're going to put it, it's time for the sticks. So sticks are important because they create aeration throughout the pile. So that's your first layer on the bottom.
The third step, it happens in your kitchen. So separate your food scraps from your trash. You can use any type of container that you have handy. So like an ice cream container, as long as your containers have a lid. Or if you want to be fancy, have like a small compost bucket.
And you want a lid because otherwise it will smell and it can attract flies. That's if you don't empty it within the first couple of days. And so the next thing you want to do is that when your container is full, you want to take it to the compost bin and empty it.
Okay, so this is number 5, browns and greens. So these are the resources you add to your compost pile. So the browns, aka carbon, include dead leaves, sticks, paper, etc. And these are the materials that are like dead and they don't smell. The greens, aka nitrogen, is food waste, grass clippings, etc. And these tend to be the resources that do smell.
And this can be the part where people get confused about composting, but it just takes a bit of time to remember which things are which, but you'll get there. It's just about experimenting and trying your best when you first start. So this is how you layer your compost bin. So you have the sticks on the bottom, as we said, and then you want your layer of browns like dead leaves or ripped up paper or toilet rolls. And then you want your green layer, so like your fresh grass clippings or your food scraps. And you just continue with brown, green, brown, green, brown, green. And this blue is just showing to keep your compost moist with water, otherwise it won't.
Oh, guys, your thing has just been muted. Oh, yeah, thank you.
So you just add moisture, otherwise it won't be able to break down. So you just continue like this till your compost pile is full. And make sure you always cover your compost pile with a brown layer, so it's like leaves or paper. Otherwise your compost pile will attract flies and it will stink, and you don't want that.
And that's like the part when most people give up on composting because they think, oh, it's so grotty. So yeah, just make sure you have that brown layer, very important. And the layers don't have to be that thick either, just like a couple of centimeters, yeah. So as mentioned, there are 3 different types of composters that we categorize. So the time poor composter is when you want to do your part for our environment, but don't have a lot of time. And the good citizen composter is you don't have much spare time. And then the compost fanatic is when you don't want to stop composting, like us, for example.
So the time poor composter, what to do when you want to do your part, but you don't have much time. Oh, let's move this. So the time poor composter does composting in the simplest way possible. They just throw the green and brown materials as they have them into the compost pile. You don't need to turn the compost pile, and then once your pile is full, you can just start a new one. It's really that simple.
And the good citizen composter is you don't have a lot of spare time, so you just chuck in your green and brown materials as you have them. So don't really worry about layering it, just making sure that you have more brown materials than green, as if you have too much green, it becomes sloshy and smell bad. And they turn their power every now and then to speed up the process, and that's the difference between the good citizen composter and the time poor composter, is the turning, which you can do with like a compost aerator or a pitchfork. And then this compost will take about 6 months to a year to break down, and you know when it's broken down because it will smell like earth, so really sweet and good, and it will also be nice and crumbly and like black, like brownie, not burnt brownie, but yeah.
And finally, the compost fanatic. So what you do when you love composting and you don't want to stop. So the compost fanatic follows all the basic rules of the time poor composter and the good citizen composter. They ensure there is double the amount of brown to green materials, as this makes more high quality compost. They also track the temperature with a compost thermometer so that dairy, meat and weeds can be safely composted. And depending on the size of the pile and the materials in it, this can take between 6 weeks and 6 months to break down.
So here are some useful resources that can help you on your compost journey. So my Instagram is Kaitlyn Grows, and I just put on some tips every now and again. And I also have a compost business called Kai Compost, where I do compost consulting. So yeah. And then Compostable Kate, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. She's very famous. And this is on Instagram. She has great fun reels on how to compost and problems that people have and how to overcome them. Shareways is another great resource. They have an app, Instagram, Facebook, or website, and this is like a resource you can use to connect your community together. So there's like a map, and you can see where people nearby want to have food scraps to compost. So if you don't want to compost, you can donate it to them, or you can donate it to a garden, as it said in the compost video. And then Jess's Instagram is Eco Runaway Jess, and she posts about composting sometimes, but all just environmental stuff in general.
And also on share waste. So when we were on holiday once, we didn't want to put our food waste in the landfill, so we just looked on the share waste app and found someone that we could send or put our food waste into a compost. So that's also a great resource for when you're on holiday and you don't want to contribute to the climate crisis.
And this is another resource that we've made, is how to set up a school composting system. So we'll put the link on this PowerPoint after, and then you can get this PowerPoint and look at it if you so wish. So yeah.
Okay, now it's time for questions. So I'll just see if there's anything in the chat, but feel free to put your questions in there.
And shown here is a video that we made with the Rotorua Lakes Council when we were interns, and that also just shows you how to set up a home composting system. So feel free to watch it on YouTube.
Okay, so our first question that we have is, do you need to add worms to your compost bin that isn't a worm farm? So as we mentioned, you need to have your compost bin on soil or grass, and this is so the worms come up through the grass and into your compost bin. So this means you don't need to add worms.
Yeah, if you buy worms, that would be the tiger worms. They're the special type of worm that you need for worm farming. But yeah, if you just have a compost bin on grass, the worms will find their own way. Composting is meant to be cheap and easy to do, so there's no pressure to buy worms. No, yeah.
Only for worm farms you need to add worms.
Okay, next question. Can you please explain the benefits of temperature testing again? Yeah, so we'll just go back to the Compost Fanatic. So there's a thing called hot composting, which is where you make all your compost pile at once, and this allows the compost pile to heat up quite high and quickly, and so this allows dairy and meat to be composted safely because the temperatures will be high enough to kill off the pathogens. So that's about like 55 to 60 degrees, which is quite achievable if you have quite a big compost pile, because the bigger the pile, the more heat it will obtain.
And if you're not in New Zealand, like Australia, for example, or you live in a really hot part, you need to ensure that you water your compost. Otherwise, hot compost piles can be set on fire.
No, that's only in Australia, not New Zealand.
So anyone from Australia, just be careful.
Oh yeah, and with the weed seeds. So if you have weeds that has like seeds, for example, like it's like oxalis, then you can compost that because the weeds will be burnt off and killed. Okay. Now the next question. How do I get carbon for the compost in summer when there aren't fallen leaves? Oh, great question. So with this, you can just raid your recycling bin. So like your toilet rolls, your paper, your newspaper, your cardboard, just rip that all up and put it in your compost bin. And otherwise, for example, now there's an abundance of leaves everywhere. Like I'm biking and I just see carbon heaven. So like you can also just collect brown leaves and just put in a bag and save it for the summer when there's not a lot of carbon.
So it'll break down and it'll turn into leaf mulch.
Yeah, or you can also just like dry your weeds out and they'll turn brown, and that's a source of carbon. Or your grass clippings, let that dry out, and then that's a source of carbon because they'll turn brown and beautiful into carbon.
Yeah. So next question: are there a few food materials that shouldn't go in a compost? So for cold composting, which is
cold composting is like the time poor composter and the good citizen composter.
So when you just chuck all your food waste on
in your bin,
and you don't make it all at once. So most people that do this don't add meat or dairy just because the pathogens don't like die. So I'd recommend if you're a beginner composter not to add dairy or meat. But if you're a more experienced composter and you kind of know what you're doing, you can add dairy and meat. Like that's what we do.
Yeah, and like you can just add whatever you feel comfortable with in the beginning. Like when we started, we just add like whatever. Like we just saved kitchen scraps, and that's basically it. So we started off as a time poor composter as well. So just do what you can. Yeah.
Also, some people don't add compostable packaging in their compost bin because it's like a plastic substance and they don't like plastic in their thing, even though it's not technically plastic. Yeah. So it's just up to what you feel comfortable putting in your bin.
And do you have any tips or tools for turning compost? Yeah, so actually in this video that we showed here by the Little Lakes Council, we show you the different tools that you can use. So like a compost aerator, which is like $20 you can buy from like Mitre 10 Mega, or you can just use like a fork, like the garden forks, not and turn it.
Or you can use a trowel. That would take a while, but you can.
Yeah, and then
You could even technically use your hands.
Yeah, you could.
That would just take longer.
Yeah. What about tips? I personally love the compost aerator because it's so easy and like you don't have to do a lot of work. But otherwise I don't really turn my compost. I kind of just leave it there as well. There's benefits to not turning it. So yeah.
Turning it just speeds up the process.
Yeah.
So any other questions? Oh.
Is it okay to use a tumbler compost bin? This isn't in contact with the ground, so I don't need to add worms. Okay, so I have heard about tumbler composting and I've seen it before. I personally don't like it because it's not in contact with the, so I find it quite weird. I haven't done it before. I don't actually know if you need to add worms. I would assume so. That might be a question to look up on the internet.
Yeah, I think you need to add worms.
Yeah, and I feel like in a tumbler compost bin, they would get really dry and take a while to break down. But you can use it if you so wish. That'd be good if you don't have any gross space and just concrete. But yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, that was the last slide.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for coming. And if you have any more questions, feel free to email us on these emails here, or like flick us a message on Instagram. And this recording will be available later. So if we spoke too fast, sorry, but you can also watch it again later. So
yeah.
There's
also more information on the Rotorua Lakes Council website under Reduce Your Waste, which is what we wrote when we were interns there. So you might have some questions and they'll have the answers. So, yeah. Thank you for coming.
Happy composting.